So now we're on to Plan B, and here's Plan B. No one will introduce our legislation. We may have one or two small hopes yet, but it won't pass, right? Because if 120 of them won't even talk to you about it, they're probably not going to vote for it, right? I mean, that just makes sense. So Plan B is to sue them, and that's what we're involved in right now. We are going to sue the state of California for lack of representation and dilution of vote. Now, I want to be very clear about this. There is no judicial way under the rules of engagement to split a state. We will not split the state of California in court. We cannot and we will not. But here's what we can and will do. And we have a lot of Supreme Court and case law to back this up. And if anybody has any questions about the specifics of that, I've got it right here and I'd be happy to read to you what I know. The case law tells us that, in fact, Amendment 14, Section 2 tells us that no one's vote, no male citizen. I think that's been addressed with subsequent amendments. But in the case of the 14th Amendment, and in fact, the Constitution is funny. The Constitution never denied women the right to vote. Women under the Constitution of the United States always had the right to vote. But in about the 1830s and 40s with Tammany Hall and some of the corruption that was going on in the big cities and in Congress as well, they tried to say that only men were allowed to vote. And that was never true, and it's still not true. But that was subsequently corrected in amendments after the 14th. So anyway, it says that no one may abridge anyone's right to vote, any male inhabitant in the United States. No one may abridge their right to vote in any way whatsoever. In any way whatsoever. It also says that Article 4, Section 4 says that states are guaranteed a Republican form of government. Republican in this case means representative, not party politics. So we are guaranteed a representative form of government. We are guaranteed by Constitution, and the 14th Amendment specifically made the Constitution applicable to the states. And that's been illustrated in many, many Supreme Court cases. And in fact, the Supreme Court recently ruled in D.C. versus Heller that the Second Amendment is not a federal right. It is a right that applies to the states the same as free speech and the same as any other right. So amendments to the Constitution also apply to the states, which means we cannot be denied representation and we may not have our vote abridged in any way whatsoever. Okay, so we get down to the meat of it now. The case is this. In California, in 1849, there were 10 counties with 9 senators. And the only reason there weren't 10 senators is everyone involved agreed that San Luis Obispo County had so few people that the state senator for Santa Barbara County would pass through San Luis Obispo and talk to the 3 people that lived there every couple months, and he'd just take care of their business for them. And they were all fine with that because San Luis Obispo County was so sparsely populated it wasn't really an issue. So we had 10 counties and 9 senators. And in fact, in 1850, there was a real move afoot by Andre Pico, a very famous Mexican general who whipped the United States Dragoons pretty bad in the Battle of San Pascual. Well, he became a famous legislator in the state of California because once he lost the Mexican War and he knew that it was a foregone conclusion, he said, this America, it might not be a bad thing. I mean, this liberty is kind of cool. So he said, if you can't whip them, join them. He was a very famous statesman, a very liberty-minded individual. He was a great lawmaker, and he was also a fairly large landowner. But what Andre said was, and in the constitutional working papers for 1850, they did not want California to immediately become a state because they were worried that the transitory nature of the North, made up mostly of gold miners who didn't own any property, were here to suck the money out of the ground and then they'd go back to Pennsylvania or wherever they came from. He was very worried that the southern landholders, the big Mexican land grants, the ranchers, the farmers, and he called it the agrarian South. There wasn't a lot of agriculture up north at that time. Most of it was down south. And he was very worried that the permanence of the property owners would be overwhelmed by the transient nature of people in the north. So what he wanted, and the people who were helping him, they wanted the border of the state of California to be at 36 degrees 30 minutes north, which was the northern boundary of San Luis Obispo County. And that Southern California should be a territory so that they could very studiously construct a constitution that would guarantee liberty for the people in Southern California. But of course, he was outvoted by the transient Northerners who outnumbered him very seriously, because Southern California was pretty sparse in those days, and they lost by 2 votes. So California became a state in total with 10 counties and 9 senators. In 1879, the Constitution capped the number of legislators at 120 people, 80 assembly people and 40 senators. And they did that for racial purposes. They did it because the theme, and that's the Constitution, by the way, that we live under now. They were more modern men, they said. We are more modern than the 1849 guys. So the Constitution should reflect the changing times. There's that living document thing. And it raised its ugly head in California in 1879. The principles of liberty were sacrificed because times were changing, and we need to change with the times. But remember, liberty is a concept that's 2,000 or more years old. And the Constitution wasn't meant to protect us against changing times. It was meant to protect us against the good intentions of well-meaning tyrants. And human nature never changes. So in 1879, the Working Man's Party took over the Constitution, and they said, we need to construct a Constitution that will keep the Chinese out. In fact, Article 19 of the California Constitution said it's a felony to hire a Chinese person. And that stayed on the books until 1952. I don't think it was really ever enforced. I can't find anything about it, so I'm not sure. But it was their intent to cap representation so that a growing Chinese population would never attain enough representation to affect events in California. And you know, it's funny about things like that, because the law of unintended consequences is pretty consistent throughout history, isn't it? We do some things for this reason, but the consequences are far removed from what the original guys intended them to be whenever they try to subjugate liberty. And Edmund Burke said in 1721, and to show you there's nothing new under the sun, Edmund Burke said in 1721, he said that wherever there's liberty, there's usually a fight against it. Because evil men, aspiring men, vain men, and greedy men will always work to defeat liberty. Because with liberty, you have the power. With monarchy and oligarchy and theocracy, they have the power, and you don't. All right, so we know that the Constitution of California was derived to cap representation in order to deny certain groups of people that representation. Well, the law of unintended consequences is this. As the cities grew, more representation was assigned to the cities and less was assigned to rural areas. Until finally there was an imbalance in California around the turn of the century, where rural and agricultural interests realized that, you know, gosh, we're creating more and more counties, but we're not creating more and more senators. Senators were capped at 40, remember? So as we hit 50, 55, 58 counties, now there are counties that didn't have a senator. And in 1926, the California Farm Bureau Federation came up with Prop 28. And Prop 28, according to the authors, and this is a quote, was intended to restore a federal plan of government to California. What is a federal plan? A federal plan is every state has 2 senators. Wyoming has 2, and California, with a population that is 66 times more than Wyoming's, only has 2. Vermont has 2 as one of the tiniest states in America, and Alaska, the biggest state in the United States, has 2. That was called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. It was intended to balance the unbridled passion of the majority. Because remember, what liberty in constitutional republic means, we don't have democracy. Democracy in France was a failure. Our founding fathers knew that you must check the unbridled passion of the people, or they will overwhelm the inalienable rights of the minority. So we had a system of checks and balances so that the inalienable rights of the minority, no matter who is in power, were always going to remain in strength. Well, the way they did that was they created the federal model of government. Well, California Farm Bureau Federation in 1926 said that's a good idea because we can restore balance to California, checks and balances, where competing interests are balanced in government. Well, Prop 28 said that roughly each county will have one state senator. Now, when I say roughly, Alpine County has 1,700 people, Sierra County has 3,000 people. Some counties were asked to share because why? We were capped by Constitution at 40 senators. But it was no more than 3 counties, and those counties had to touch one another. So roughly every county had a state senator, and guess what? It worked. Because we had checks and balances. The intent of California Farm Bureau Federation was that agriculture and rural interest would govern the Senate and that the unbridled passion of the people would govern the Assembly. And so the people would have their voice. Now, that's not a denial of one man, one vote, folks. It's not. I would vote for the senator in Siskiyou County. I had a vote. I just wouldn't vote for the senator in Shasta County. The people in Shasta County each had a vote. No one was trying to deny a vote, but they would only vote for the representative, much like we do in Congress. I don't vote for the congressman in New York. I don't vote for Hawaii's senator. I vote for my own. So it was in no way a denial of one man, one vote, and that's important, and I'll get to why in a few minutes. And Prop 28 passed, and California worked, because we had a rural caucus that was very effective in blunting the cities when they were passionate about the cause of the day. Whether that's gun control or booze or I don't care what it is. If the people in the city were saying, God, we just can't stand stray dogs anymore, we have to kill all dogs that are not on a leash. Well, gosh, I have 3 dogs on my ranch and they've never seen a leash. They wouldn't know what it was. They'd probably chew it in half anyway. But it doesn't hurt anyone on my place, where it might in the city. So there are competing interests, and there are different ways of life, and each one of those ways is valid. But those ways should be defended locally with local decisions by local government and the input of local people. Alex de Tocqueville wrote a book in 1825. It was called The American Republic. The name was later changed to Democracy in America. But he said in 1825, the greatest form of government known to man is the township. Because local decisions are made locally with local wisdom and local talent and local knowledge, and representation works best over the smallest district. In other words, if your local guy has a decision that you absolutely hate, it is cheap and easy to get rid of him. You go to your neighbors and you say, hey, Joe's not doing a good job. What say we put up Mary or Bill? And we can do it. It's not too expensive. We only need a couple of thousand people or 10,000 people or whatever. And you run somebody against them and you can do it. You know, in California, you almost, in fact, the attorneys are looking through the metrics right now. We find very, very few examples of when the voters unseat an incumbent, because one state senator represents 1 million people. It's pretty hard to get rid of them because it costs millions of dollars to run that campaign. In New Hampshire, it cost $1,000 to run a political campaign. They have 3,700 people per district. The guy pays a $1,000 filing fee and he knocks on 3,000 doors and says, vote for me. And if he does a lousy job, 3,000 people get together and they get rid of him. And that's cheap too. That's what we want in Jefferson.